Hi everybody. So one thing sociologists are really interested in is why people commit crimes. Why do they take this deviance to a criminal level? So what we're going to do right now is apply sociological theory to some recent crimes. So this is information both that's on your exam this week, or maybe it's an example of how you want to apply sociological theory to whatever current event you do for your group project. All right, first up, a recent crime in the news is the race riots in Ferguson, Missouri. And the social theory that we can use to help understand this one is Durkheim's concept of anomie. And so according to Durkheim, people don't know how to behave in times of rapid social change because your norms crumble. And then that puts people on edge, it means there's a lot of tension, and it means crime is more likely to occur. So in terms of Ferguson, they've actually had a lot of change there recently. So over the past 10 years, the black population in Ferguson has increased by about 15 percentage points, but the police force has stayed heavily white, reflecting the previous demographics in the city. Now this has led to difficulties for officers because the norms they had about their police work changed. They began to get accused of a lot of racial profiling. And then it's also caused a lot of change for community members, both black and white. And so when there was the shooting, it rapidly escalated into the violence and the race riots and the looting. So this one is considered a functional theory. Durkheim is very much a functional theorist anytime you're looking at something from him, but it's also because you're looking at how society generally works together to function, but when things change a lot, there become dysfunctions. All right, well, let's look at one more functional theory. So this is Robert Merton's strain theory. So right now, this month, there are 12 teachers from Atlanta on trial for widespread cheating on standardized tests, for erasing student answers, for telling students answers, a pretty elaborate cheating scheme. So for Merton, his main belief is that Americans, or any culture, in this case it's Americans, that they want to meet cultural goals. And so in this case, meeting your federal education progress is a cultural goal. And ideally, you should be getting that through what he calls institutionalized means. So those are the appropriate ways to get there. In this case, it would be hard work, student interventions, good teaching practices. And then Merton thinks that people commit crime when they want to reach that goal. They want to make their federal progress, they want to get their funding, but they don't have the means. Maybe they have enormous numbers of poor students or students who don't speak English, or they may also possibly just not be very good teachers. They may not have that kind of mean there. And so then he says you have 5 options. And in purple is the criminal one that these teachers chose. So first option would have been conformity. So the teachers would have accepted both the goal and the mean. They would have worked harder, started new programs, and met their goals that way. Now in innovation, they still really want that goal. They want to make their yearly progress, but they decide to use a different mean. In this case, cheating. Innovation is the one usually where there is crime involved with strain theory. Your other option is to just sort of give up on the goal, but still try. So these would be teachers that were just sort of doing the bare minimum on their job, but not really caring if they meet a goal. So this does not make you a criminal. It might make you a bad teacher, but it does make you deviant because you're giving up on the goal and the social norm. Your next option is retreatism, which is where you give up on the goals and the means. So this would be a teacher just, giving up on the class totally, spending your days letting the class run wild. You just don't care anymore. And then rebellion is a little rarer, and that's where you try to change the social structure just entirely. Maybe they break off and start their own school and refuse any federal funding or local funding. The more likely options are the first two, either conformity or innovation. And in this case, it's innovation, which sounds so positive, but in strain theory generally means crime. All right, so let's look at a conflict theory approach to a crime. So BNP Paribas, which is France's largest bank, they also do business in the United States. And they just got from the United States government a $9 billion fine for evading U.S. sanctions against Iran, Sudan, and Cuba. So what they were doing was they, over the course of about 10 years, were supposed to stop doing business with those countries, but instead they kept doing transactions about $190 billion worth. Um, so a conflict theorist would say that people who are in privileges of power and prestige, so BNP, they're the largest bank in France, they have an international presence, they want to keep up their power and privilege, and if that means doing something criminal and avoiding sanctions, then they'll do it to keep making sure that their business stays on top. I mean, eventually the fine caught up with them, but like it mentions in your book, the sanctions for white-collar crime tend to be relatively minor compared to what they've done. So I mean, it's 190 billion in transactions and a $9 billion fine, which was, I mean, transactions is not the same thing as a bank's profits. So 9 billion is pretty sizey in terms of their profits, but people will probably not do any jail time over this either. All right, and then one last one, let's look at a symbolic interaction theory and some discussion of crime. So labeling theory says that when people start to get a criminal label, they'll continue to act on it. So if you call someone a druggie for smoking pot, that they're more likely to keep getting into harder and harder drugs. And one debate that's come up recently is if you label illegal immigrants as criminals, would that make them then more likely to continue in deviance? And this has come into the news from a speech that Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor gave in February, and she said, I think people then paint those individuals as something less than worthy human beings, and it changes the conversation. And there's not necessarily a lot of research that's conclusive on illegal immigration and crime rates because there's a lot of correlating factors in there, but it is something to consider just when you're thinking about the way we label people, what behavior does that encourage in the future? All right, I hope this helps.